Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about why public database as a service solutions are ripe for open source disruption. And I will try to bring across a couple of points with you. The first one is what database as a service has really won in a database space. The second one, if you don't know it already, what the software vendor lock-in sucks. And a third one, what as usually open source will come to the rescue. But before we get to that, let me take you to the early days of modern open source. If you look at late 90s, when Linux was just coming about, open source was kind of complicated. If you really wanted to use open source software, you often would have to download the sources, figure out what compiler they work with, and maybe do some manual patching, and then get it work. And then from that, we get things happening more and more simple. We got RGZ binaries, then we have packages and dependencies, as David and RPM, package repositories. Now we have solutions like Docker and Snap, where you can very easily install the whole package from their internet, right, in just basically a few minutes. So what we see is what we have a never-ending move towards simplicity going on, right, which is absolutely fantastic. And if you think about the databases, then database as a service is the state of art of that simplicity for databases. All of that goes in the same trend, which I would think about making it easy and really reducing barrier to entry, which is very important because if you look at the modern open source, right, compared to open source of 20 years ago, right, we have much less hardcore developers. And if you look at their modern open source developer and say, well, you know what, can you just create all your tool set from scratch, compile it from resources? Probably handful, if anyone, would be able to comfortable to do it. And that is not a bad thing. That really allows us to use more complicated and more valuable software to be more productive. That allows more people than otherwise to be the open source developers. But this also comes with a dark side as you think about the open source and databases. Because the next step really comes with a vendor lock-in in the cloud, which is not a good thing if you are an open source advocate. The cloud itself is kind of deceptive how it came into our life. If you look at the early days cloud, and this image you see now was taken by me from the early Amazon Web Services presentation. It was about their utility service. It doesn't make sense to make your own electricity in most cases. Well, makes sense. But the thing with electricity is it is well standardized commodity, and you can swap electricity vendors as you wish, and still can keep your TV, or microwave working no matter what, right? In a cloud, though, right now there is a lot of push from that commodity to highly differentiated solutions which lock you in and which only work in that particular cloud. This is like, well, if you want to change your provider electricity, everything ranging from your laptop to your TV must go, and you will have to buy the incompatible set of devices with different features. Well, doesn't sound very well. So in reality, as we can see, the modern clouds, they do not want you to just use at the commodity services such as compute or storage, but often want to move up to high value proposition, which may increase your productivity, but then they also make it much harder to live, right? And in the end, you sort of can choose what kind of cloud you have and how much freedom do you really want to embrace, and actually what you're ready to pay for it, because as it always goes, the freedom is not free, and in this case, it will likely require you to do more work. Now, if you look at the current state, the current state of the open source software and databases in particular, if you want the easiest, fastest way to deploy it, would be to do it in the cloud using proprietary API of database as a service, right? Something as Amazon RDS, Aurora, right? Or similar solution with other services. Now, of course, there are other choices as well. You can roll your own using various your own building block like storage, compute, but that would be harder than using database as a service. And database as a service is actually wonderful as a concept because it really removes a lot of toil, a lot of that kind of unproductive activities which you just would rather not to do, right? And would rather focus on providing something of a value for a business, such as building the application. What is also wonderful with the database as a service is what this shifts a lot of power to developers, because now developers themselves can go ahead and deploy the database instance in the cloud in just a few minutes, instead of negotiating with DBA and then waiting maybe days or weeks for deployment. That is wonderful. Now, what you see with a lot of those database as a service solutions is what they are called open source compatible. Now, I want to explain what that open source compatible means. That typically means one-way compatibility. But if you are running the open source solutions elsewhere, it will be very easy for you to move to the cloud version and probably get even more value from that in convenience, performance, additional features, and so on and so forth. But then it's very likely, and that will be the goal of the cloud vendors, for you to use as many of those proprietary value-added features, so it will be very hard to move back. Another interesting thing with a database of a service is what it's often called fully managed. And that is really over-marketed and then not understood correctly. To give that fully managed terms, you see cloud vendors very often use the term of shared responsibility. Who is responsible for database performance? Well, it's actually shared responsibility, because if you as a developer design very bad schema and throw very bad queries on the database, you know what? No the database technology will be able to handle that that efficiently. That will be your responsibility, even in a fully managed database as a service. And what that means is what you actually need to have some database knowledge and DBA skill to be able to run your database as a service, even fully managed database as a service, successfully and cost efficiently. Another challenge with that promise, of course, is what developers choose and use that database without the supervision of a database professionals. And actually, bad stuff can happen because of that. You can see probably in the recent years a lot of security incidents reported, because security is also shared responsibility. And if you chose to open your database more widely than you should have, there is very little cloud vendor can do to prevent it. Or cost efficiency, right? If you are just scaling your database by the credit card and spending 5 or 10 times more than you should have, well, guess what? That's on you. Cloud vendors are not going to particularly cry about their revenues being higher. What I think is also interesting of database as a service is what the database as a service premium over the last years have been growing compared to the cost of a hardware, of the instance on the cloud. This is the data from Amazon and EC2, and you can see it showing those instances up to 78%, right? Almost double the price, right? And as you look at the new instances, especially Graviton instance, it can actually surpass twice the cost of an instance, instance alone in some cases. So that fully managed experience is expensive, especially in large case, large environments. And well, this database as a vendor login, it may not be very painful for you now, but in the future, it is likely to be more and more painful if you do not deal with that. And we actually have a good history lesson for that. In some years ago, Oracle and Larry Ellison were really saving people from the dominance of a big blue, right, and a hardware vendor lock-in. But guess where we are now? Well, now many people would say or agree with the expression what Oracle doesn't have customers, Oracle has hostages, because once you embrace something like Oracle database, you will be very much locked in, and that will be a very hard solution to replace. So the question here becomes is, can we get that database as a service like Simplicity, but as open source solution? And here I have some bad news for you, unfortunately. We are not quite there yet. But the good news is we are moving in the right direction. The first piece of a great news is Kubernetes. And Kubernetes has been the cornerstone of this fantastic ecosystem of a cloud native applications, right? You can now see what there are literally hundreds of different components and actually technology providers available building this stack of applications, which maybe not as mature as a cloud-specific solutions yet, but it is growing very, very rapidly. And in my opinion, that is the case of the open source catches up again and will be given this, this choice. What do I mean by open source catching up again? Well, somebody who has been in this industry for more than 20 years, I remember, for example, how much of a toy the Linux was in late 90s. People who were running real operating systems like Solaris, HP UX, or even Windows NT were laughing about it. But guess what? Now Linux is by far the dominant operating system, with the features in many cases surpasses what those proprietary operating systems had. The key component when it comes to the databases for in Kubernetes step is the Kubernetes operators. The Kubernetes operators is a component which really can provide the value similar to a database as a service, which is simplify day one and day two automation and help to really simplify development. Though user experience of a Kubernetes is kind of different. And if you are not Kubernetes expert, you may find it harder than a database as a service where you can provision solution just in a full clicks. The thing though is that Kubernetes and the operators specifically can be a fantastic building block to build build Kubernetes, build the database as a service solution. And in fact, it is not only hypothetical. If you look at many modern database as a service solutions, they are actually built on the Kubernetes and the Kubernetes operators underneath. Here is a list of some of them, and I only listed here those which have publicly spoken about using Kubernetes underneath. In reality, the list of those technologies is likely to be a lot higher. You can also see the report from the Data on Kubernetes community, which looked into what kind of data is stored on Kubernetes, right? Or what technologies is using this kind of data on stateful workloads on Kubernetes. And you can see the databases are actually number one. So the Kubernetes and database as a service are, Kubernetes is increasingly being used for database technologies. So what do we see in the future? And where do we believe innovation will continue happening? We think while they're not quite there yet, we see a lot of trends in the open source database ecosystem to provide in the open source space a database-like experience, which works both in public and a private cloud. And we in Percona, of course, are looking to be the members of this development. So let me finish with the same things I started with. I truly believe what open source of database as a service has won because it really provides unparalleled and seductive convenience of using the database, even in their for open source database of technologies. Software vendor lock-in sucks, especially over long term, and open source is there to come to rescue if you really choose to embrace it, if that's the path you choose. With that, that's all I have to say, and thank you for tuning in.